Welcome to Reading with Nana, and hi to my returning friends. Today I'll read Chapter 4 of Heidi, the novel written by Johanna Spiri. Next morning, Peter came again with his goats, and Heidi went along with them up in the pasture. This continued day after day, and it was by this means that Heidi grew stronger and healthier and more tanned by the sun every day. Soon the autumn came, and as the cold wind blew hard across the mountainside, the grandfather would say, "You must stay home today, Heidi, for the wind can blow such a little thing as you down into the valley with a single gust." It always made Peter unhappy, however, when Heidi did not come along, for he would look at everything in a darker light. He hardly knew how to pass his time, and besides, he was deprived of his extra food. The goats were so accustomed to Heidi by this time that they did not follow Peter when she was not with him. Heidi did not mind staying at home, for she loved nothing better than to watch her grandfather work his saw and hammer. Sometimes the grandfather would make small round cheeses on those days, and Heidi could imagine no greater pleasure than to see him stir the butter with his bare arms. When the wind would howl through the fir trees on those stormy days, Heidi would run to the grove, thrilled at the wonderful roaring in the branches. The sun was losing its vigor, and the child had to put on her shoes and stockings and her little dress. The weather grew colder and colder. When Peter came up in the morning, he would blow into his hands. He was so frozen. At last, Peter did not come any more, for a deep snow had fallen overnight. Heidi stood at the window, watching the snow falling down. It kept on snowing till it reached the windows. Still, it did not stop, and soon the windows could not be opened, and they were all shut in. When the snowstorm had continued for several days, Heidi thought that it would soon cover up the cottage. However, the snow finally stopped falling, and the grandfather went outside to shovel the snow away from the door and windows, piling it up high here and there. Later on that afternoon, the two were sitting near the fire when noisy steps were heard outside and the door was opened. It was Peter. He had come up to see Heidi. Muttering a good evening, he joined them by the fire. His face was beaming red, and Heidi had to laugh when she saw little waterfalls trickling down from his body onto the floor, for all the ice and snow was melting from that great heat put off by the fire. The grandfather asked Peter how he got along in school, and Heidi showered him with 100 questions. Poor Peter, who was not much of a talker, found himself in great difficulty as he tried to answer the little girl's inquiries. But at least all this talking gave him the time to dry out his clothes. During this conversation, the grandfather's eyes had been twinkling, and at last said to the boy, "Now that you have been under the fire for so long from all this questioning, you need some strengthening, don't you? Come and join us for supper." With that, the old man prepared a meal which was very well satisfied the boy's ravenous appetite. As it was fast growing dark outside, Peter decided it was time for him to go. So he said goodbye and thank you, and then turning to Heidi, he remarked, "I shall come next Sunday, if I may. By the way, Heidi, grandmother asked me to tell you that she would love to see you." Heidi immediately agreed to the idea, and the first thing out of her mouth the next morning was, "Grandfather, I must go down to grandmother. She is expecting me." 4 days later, the sun was shining, and the tight packed frozen snow crackled under every step. Heidi was sitting at the dinner table, again imploring the old man to let her make the visit to grandmother. Then he got up and fetched the heavy cover from Heidi's bed and told her to follow him. They walked outside into the glistening snow. A beautiful quiet covered the whole mountainside, and the snow laden fir trees shone and glittered in the sun. Heidi, in wonder and amazement, ran to and fro, crying out, "Grandfather, come out! Oh, look at the trees! They are all covered with silver and gold." Grandfather was just coming out of his workshop with a wide sled. Wrapping the child up in her cover, he put her on the sled and held her fast. Off they started down the hill at such a pace that Heidi shouted for joy. They seemed to be flying like a bird. The sled finally stopped in front of Peter's hut, and Grandfather said, "Go on in. When it gets dark, we shall start back home." He unwrapped her and lifted her off the sled and then headed back to home. Opening the door, Heidi found herself in a tiny, dark kitchen. Then she entered through another doorway, which led into a narrow chamber. Near a table sat a woman, busy mending Peter's coat. Heidi recognized the coat immediately. A bent old woman was sitting in the corner. Heidi, approaching her at once, said, "How do you do, grandmother? I have come now, and I hope I haven't kept you waiting too long." Lifting her head, the grandmother felt for Heidi's hand. Touching it thoughtfully, she said, "Are you the little girl who lives up the mountain with the uncle? Is your name Heidi?" "Yes," Heidi replied. "The grandfather has just brought me down in the sled." "How is it possible? Your hands are as warm as toast. Brigida, did the uncle really come down with the child?" Brigida, Peter's mother, had come over to look at the child. She said, "I don't know if he did, but I don't think so. She probably doesn't know." Heidi, looking at Peter's mother, and quite decidedly, "I know that grandfather wrapped me up in a cover and we coasted down here together." "Peter was right after all," said the grandmother. "We never thought the child would live more than 3 weeks with him. Brigida, tell me what she looks like." "She has Adelaide's fine limbs and dark eyes, and curly hair like Tobias and the old man. I think she looks a little bit like both of them." While the women were talking, Heidi had been taking in all of her surroundings. Then she said, "Grandmother, look at the shutter over there. It is hanging loose. If grandfather were here, he would fasten it into place. Surely it will break the window pane. Just look at it." "What a sweet child you are," said the grandmother tenderly. "I can hear it, but I cannot see it, child. This cottage rattles and creaks, and when the wind blows, it comes in through everything. Someday the whole house will break to pieces and fall down on top of us. If only Peter knew how to mend it. We have no one else to help us." "Why, grandmother, can't you see the shutter?" asked Heidi. "Child, I cannot see anything," lamented the old woman. "Can you see when I open the shutter to let in the light?" "No, no, not even then. Nobody can ever show me the light again. But surely you can see when you go outside into the snow where everything is bright. Come with me, grandmother. I'll show you." Heidi took the old woman by the hand and tried to lead her out. Heidi was frightened and was growing more anxious now. "Just let me stay here, child. Everything is dark for me, and my poor eyes can neither see the snow nor the light." "But, grandmother, isn't there more light in the summertime when the sun shines down on the mountains and says good night, setting them all aflame?" "No, child. I can never see the fiery mountainsides anymore. I have to live in darkness always." Heidi burst out crying now and sobbed aloud. "Is there anybody who can make it light for you? Isn't there anybody who can do it, grandmother? Anybody?" The grandmother tried all possible means to comfort the child. It pained her to see the little one in such distress. It was awfully hard for Heidi to stop crying once she had started, for she cried so seldom. Then grandmother told her, "Heidi, let me tell you something. People who cannot see always love to hear friendly words. Sit down beside me and tell me all about yourself. Talk to me about your grandfather, for it has been long since I heard anything about him. I used to know him very well." Heidi suddenly wiped away her tears, for just then she had a cheerful thought. "Grandmother, I shall tell grandfather about it, and I am sure he can make the light come in here for you. He can mend your little house and stop the rattling." The old woman remained silent. and Heidi, with much animation, began describing her life with the grandfather. Listening attentively, the two women would say to each other sometimes, "Do you hear what she said about the uncle? Do you hear that?" Heidi's tale was interrupted suddenly when they heard a great thumping on the door. And who should come in but Peter? As soon as he had seen Heidi, he smiled, his round eyes opening as wide as possible. Heidi called out, "Good evening, Peter." "Is it really time for him to come home?" exclaimed Peter's grandmother. "How quickly the time has flown." "Good evening, little Peter. How is your reading going?" "Just the same," the boy replied. "Oh dear, I was hoping for a change at last. You are nearly 12 years old, my boy." "Why should there be a change?" inquired Heidi with greatest interest. "I'm afraid he'll never learn how to read after all. On the shelf over there is an old prayer book filled with beautiful hymns. I have forgotten them all, for I have not heard them in a long time. I was hoping that Peter should read them to me some day, but he will never be able to." Peter's mother arose from her work and said, "I must make a light. The afternoon has passed, and now it is getting dark." When Heidi heard that, she started up, and waving a hand at them, she said, "Good night. I must go now, for it is getting dark." But the concerned grandmother called out, "Now wait, child. Don't go up alone. Go with her, Peter, and take care that she does not fall. Don't let her get cold. Do you hear? Has Heidi a shawl?" "I haven't one, but I won't be cold," Heidi called back, for she had already run through the door. She ran so fast that Peter could hardly follow her. The old woman worriedly said, "Brigida, run after her. Get a warm shawl for her, or she'll freeze in this cold night. Hurry up, Brigida." Brigida obeyed. The children had hardly gone any distance before they saw the old man coming down the hill, and it wasn't long before he was standing right there beside them. "I am glad you kept your word, Heidi," he said as he wrapped her into the cover. Then he started up the hill, carrying the child in his arms. Brigida was watching the scene, and she went inside and told the grandmother what she had witnessed. "Oh, thank God," the old woman said. "I hope she'll come again. She has done so much good. What a soft heart she has, the little darling, and how wonderfully she can talk." All evening the grandmother said to herself, "If only he lets her come again. I have something to look forward to in this world. Thank God." Heidi could hardly wait before they reached the cottage. She had tried to talk with her grandfather all along the way, but no sound could be heard through the heavy cover. As soon as they were inside the hut, she explained all that she was thinking. "Grandfather, we must take some nails and a hammer down tomorrow. There is a shutter loose in grandmother's house, and many other parts shake. Everything rattles in our house." "Is that so? Who says we must?" "Nobody told me, but I know that we must," Heidi replied. "Everything is loose in the house, and the poor grandmother told me she was afraid that the house might fall down. And grandfather, she cannot see the light. Can you help her and make a light for her? How terrible it must be to be afraid in the dark where there is nobody to help you. Oh, please, grandfather, do something to help her. I know you can." Heidi had been clinging to her grandfather and looking up to him with trusting eyes. At last he said, glancing down, "All right, child. We will be sure that the house won't rattle anymore. We can do it tomorrow." Heidi was so overjoyed at these words that she began to dance around the room, shouting, "We will do it tomorrow. We can do it tomorrow." The grandfather kept his word and took Heidi down again the following day, giving her the same instructions as before. After Heidi had disappeared inside, he went around the house inspecting it. The grandmother, in her joy at seeing the child again, had stopped her spinning wheel and called, "Here is the child again. She has come again." Heidi, grasping her outstretched hands, sat upon a low stool at the old woman's feet and began to chat. Suddenly, violent blows were heard from outside. The grandmother, in her fright, nearly upset the spinning wheel as she cried out, "Oh God, please help us. The end has come at last. The hut is tumbling down." Grandmother, don't be frightened, said the child, putting her arms around the old woman. Grandfather is just fastening the shutter and fixing everything for you. Is it possible? Has God not forgotten us after all? Brigida, have you heard it? Surely that is a hammer. Ask him to come in a moment, if it is he, for I must thank him. When Brigida went out, she found the old man busy nailing a new beam along the wall. Approaching him, she said, Mother and I wish you a good afternoon. We are very much obliged to you for doing such a service. Mother would like to see you. There are few that would have helped us. Uncle, and how can we thank you? That will do, he interrupted. I know what your opinion about me is. Go back inside, for I can find what needs mending myself. Brigida complied right away, for the uncle had a way such that nobody would want to oppose him. All afternoon, the uncle hammered about the cottage. He even climbed up on the roof, much of what was missing. At last, he had to stop when he had used up the last nail that he had brought with him. The darkness was approaching anyway, and Heidi had appeared outside the cottage. The grandfather wrapped her up as he had done the day before and carried her warm and safe in his arms, dragging the sled behind him. Thus the winter passed. Sunshine had come again into the blind woman's life, and this made her days so much less dark and dreary. Early every morning, she would begin to listen for Heidi's footsteps, and when the door was opened and the child ran in, the grandmother exclaimed each time more joyfully than before, Thank God she has come again. Heidi would talk about her life and make the grandmother smile and laugh. In this way, the hours flew by. Previously, the old woman would always sigh, Brigida, is the day not over yet? But now, she always exclaimed after Heidi's departure, How quickly the afternoon has gone by. Don't you think so, Brigida? Her daughter had to assent, for Heidi had long ago won her heart. If only God will spare this the child, the grandmother would often say. I hope the uncle will always be kind as he is now. Does Heidi look well, Brigida? Was a very frequent question, which always received an affirming answer. Heidi also became very fond of the old grandmother, and as long as the weather was fair, she visited her every day. Whenever the child recalled that the grandmother was blind, she would become very sad. Her only comfort was that her visits brought the old woman so much happiness. It wasn't long before the grandfather had mended the cottage. He would carry big loads of timber down on the sled, which he would use to make the repairs. The grandmother vowed that no rattling could be heard any more, and thanks to the uncle's kindnesses, she slept better that winter than she had done for many a year. It's a very old story, and the pictures in the book are black and white. This is Heidi and Peter. Here we have Heidi and the grandfather. And this picture is just of Heidi. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. Click like or subscribe. Until next time.